There was a group that had already existed called the Taos County Community Wildfire Protection Team. That thing was formed back in like the early 2000s, really with the monomaniacal goal of wildfire prevention. In the wake of Hermit's Peak Gap Canyon, the stuff that we were seeing over in the Jemez, there was a major concern nationwide, including in Taos, that communities could and should do a better job of organizing around the idea, really, of wildfire. And it was in 2015 that that group was approached by Laura McCarthy, who was then working for the Nature Conservancy, and offering this opportunity to take the collaboration that that group had shown between like Forest Service, BLM, Taos Pueblo, Picaris, community organizations like the Firewise communities, and start zooming out and thinking bigger. At the time, thinning projects, which were pretty nuts and bolts basic, were very focused on this idea that there's just too much fuel in the forest, let's take some of that fuel out, fires will then be less bad. Laura's approach was much more at the landscape scale and saying our concern in the Rio Grande Basin, at least in New Mexico, is that areas like Taos with so many tributaries into the Rio Grande, when we see fire here, given the condition of the forests at all elevations and in all forest types, is going to create such a disaster, not just locally for folks in Taos, but everybody down the Rio Grande. And it was premised on this idea that folks in Albuquerque and Santa Fe would then fund work in these headwater zones to reduce that fire risk, but also with more of an eye towards what we would call restoration, not just restoration, not just single-minded focused fuels reduction within the forest and solve the fire problem, but potentially inadvertently create other problems. It was with Laura coming up here and making that pitch that this thing called the Taos Valley Watershed Coalition was formed. And in the email I sent out a few weeks back, it was a link to that 2015 document. Again, I didn't write it. I have inherited it as now the coordinator of that group, kind of the ringleader. But the idea behind that was to draw a big circle. Let me see if I can find a map of this. This is that document. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look it up or not. It's online. There's a link in that email I sent out. But the gist was provide some historical context, some ecological context, community context, and then sit around a table with everybody who was at least involved at that time and start identifying places where they wanted to do work. And the number one place is a place called Pueblo Ridge. That's the north side of Taos Canyon, driving up the highway towards Palo Flechado and Angel Fire. The second place they identified was El Salto, so the association property down there up above El Salto. It's a triangle of land that sits between Taos Pueblo and the National Forest. And the third one on that list was the Rio Hondo corridor. And that's what we're sitting in now. So, all right, we'll draw, this is an arbitrary line around these watersheds. So all of the Rio Grande El Rancho, Rio Fernando, the Rio Pueblo on Taos Pueblo land, the Rio Cerro, and the Rio Hondo. And we said, with Laura's guidance, really, and encouragement, that group at the time said, this is the area we want to focus on, because these are all the tributaries that come into the Taos Valley. It extends as far up as where I live in San Cristobal, and as far down to the US Hill area. And then within that, that's how they identified those higher priorities. And it was with an eye towards where do we know the fire risk is highest, especially in the forest type that we think we can do the greatest good in, ponderosa pine, and what's called dry mixed conifer, which is kind of that zone we're in right here. And then without necessarily paying attention to the boundaries between national forest, private, tribal, even BLM in some places, how can we coordinate our efforts so that concurrently we can take on restoration, which in this case is mostly thinning and prescribed burning, in a way to meaningfully reduce the fire risk in all of those zones. The rationale for this project is that for the Rio Hondo in particular, we're sitting, as you guys all know very well, between the Columbine Hondo Wilderness and the Willow Deep Wilderness. And wilderness designations or not, there's almost nothing that can be done in terms of forest management in either of those zones, at least active management with the use of saws and crews, just because of the topography and the terrain. It's way too hard to get to, it's way too steep. The return on investment for getting in there isn't very effective, but there was an acknowledgement that in this corridor along this existing highway on the way up to the ski valley, these are the most likely ignition points, a place where somebody could leave a campfire burning, somebody could be dragging a trailer in chains or throw a cigarette out the door, and fire could start along this corridor, and then depending on the conditions, sweep up more under both sides of these canyons and get into these areas and create fire in a way that has the worst of those post-fire conditions. So, John, in your email, when you said, you came out and did an assessment, I said, this looks like a very fire reduction, fuels reduction focused project. It's exactly what it is. It was not done with an eye towards stream restoration. It was not necessarily done with an eye towards habitat improvement, though I do think that there's an argument to be made that in some cases you are going to see that over time, depending on the location and the forest type and the way succession takes place. But, the Forest Service, as this big, massive bureaucracy, has the authority to look at a place like this small, relatively small corridor and say, we're really, really worried about fire in this watershed. This is the only place we can tackle it. And so we're going to design a project that balances our values, so the values of the public that we have to consider, but pretty blatantly said this is a fuels reduction project. We want to restore, I'll use the words restore, but we want to restore the condition of the forest.
Because I think it's relevant to the discussion today, but the background of the project is, this is a pretty high-use recreation area, right? Campgrounds, hiking, just folks driving up and down the road, and then also it's one way in, one way out. There's some significant fire danger to this area. It's not a frequent fire area, but if it were to happen in the wrong conditions, wrong time, then there's pretty significant impacts to a lot of things and some high fire danger involved with it. So, there's a bunch of treatment that's been done. The upper reaches of the canyon here, around the ski valley and within the ski valley and around the community up there. And the overall intent of this is basically a treatment area that's the only place we can treat in between wilderness and not on too steep of slopes. And it's basically a wildland-urban interface fire mitigation project. Not as much of a restoration. There are restoration components to every project, certainly, but more of a wildland-urban interface, to reduce fire likelihood and impacts in the watershed, kind of a project. So I think that's a relevant background of why we're doing the project here, and why here in particular. Basically because this is all we can treat outside of wilderness, and it's the only place that's flat enough to actually access and do any kind of treatment. So, short, I guess, background if you weren't aware or hadn't heard that before.
I'll add that this was among a handful of projects that when the coalition was formed back in 2015, everybody who was at the table then said, yes, this is a high priority area for us. We're concerned about the health of this watershed. We're concerned about the likelihood of ignition, as Brent mentioned. And it's the little bit that we can do to reduce those likelihoods of catastrophic fire in this drainage for the greater landscape benefit. Really.
Perfect. And certainly is this a treatment that is going to completely remove the risk, or is it going to be something that has a huge strategical advantage if there were a fire that occurred somewhere outside of this drainage? No, it's really not. I mean, it helps, certainly helps a bunch, especially once the piles are all out of here. If there is a fire in or around here, or it starts here, there's a higher likelihood of being able to grab it if it starts in one of the campgrounds or something like that, because it doesn't have the ladder fuels to establish quickly. It's easier to access, easier to see, maybe easier to see the folks that are camping in here with abandoned campfires and things like that. So there's a handful of relevancy to it that way. And if a fire did come through here, the impact should be less as well. So it's not the complete, project that's going to make a huge difference across the entire landscape, but it certainly makes a difference in this area because of all the risks that I mentioned. So background for you, I guess, and I'll leave that at that. So implementation of this project is where we're at today. Contractors were given the go to do this. They started cutting, and it's a ton of material, an absolute tons of material. So it led to probably more material to cut and more piles than maybe was anticipated at the onset of the project. And that's kind of really what leads us here today. As you drive up and down this, which all of you have, you can see the amount of piles, and the ones you can't see from the road, there's a whole bunch more out there. So this is it's evolved into a bit of a just a little bit more complexities in it because of the amount of material that was cut and the places that we have available to put that material is really what it led to. So moving forward into the implementation portion, the plan is to burn these piles this winter once we start to have snow. It's important for a few different reasons. We were hoping that the process would be we would cut them one summer and then burn them that fall, just so we didn't have a whole fire season's worth of material out here that was rearranged and dried out and cured and red needled that had a different fire risk to it. But with the timing of the contract being awarded and completed, they didn't have enough time to cure to be able to be burned. We came out and attempted it last year and it was definitely a no-go. We would have just been left with a mess and it wouldn't work. So brings us to present day. They need to be burned this year so that we can reduce that risk that's out here, that short-term risk that we have whenever we do projects like this. The plan will be, once we have conditions to do so, will be to burn the piles all through the corridor. What we've identified as we've been looking at that actual implementation, if there are piles that are within the riparian area, right?
Yep.
Am I saying that right? It's not a corridor, it's an area of riparian that weren't planned for, essentially. So we do have piles that are within the riparian area here that is outside of what the plan was. So this winter the plan will be to burn all of the piles outside of that area. That way we can get as many of them off the table and reduce that risk, get them to burn before we lose a lot of the fine materials and the needle cast, and they all get compacted by another year of snow and they're less conducive to burning, and get everything out of here that we can outside that riparian area. That also we think is going to give us at least an idea of what the piles that are all outside of that area, what they do, what the ash looks like at the end, and kind of how that product looks once those are burned. So it's going to be quite an effort. It's going to take some coordination with the ski valley, with our smoke impacts to the road, with the air quality, with Mother Nature and the conditions and all that stuff to get this done. Probably going to take, we're calculating a couple of weeks to do it because of the amount that we can do at one time. Not only because of smoke impacts, but also just because of the area that they're all in, and trudging through snow and getting them to burn all the way down and chunking them so that there's less material left and like that. It's going to be a pretty arduous process to get them actually burned. So that's roughly the plan heading into this winter. We're just waiting for some snow so we can start to get to work on it.
This might feel like an obvious question, but how can communities leave them? Why don't we just leave these piles sitting there?
Well, first off, if somebody has a few too many cold ones and decide they want to light one off, then we have a pretty big risk there, whether it's summertime or the in-between seasons. So I think it's just too much of a temptation. Also, there's other examples of, unfortunately we had the Elvire fire last year, where it did burn in a pile unit, and when these burn outside of the time frame when we want to, when there's snow on the ground and there's, the fire behavior is mitigated, they can have some pretty severe impacts, just like it would if a fire came through and all this material was standing and it was ladder fields. Mm-hmm. Those are the basic two.
For the piles that are outside the riparian area, do you feel like you can burn them all this burn season, or is it going to take more than that?
We're going to do everything we can to burn them this burn season. I think
the ones outside of the riparian.
The ones outside of it. I think we can do it. Like I said.
So my name's Nessa Rasmussen. I'm the Carson's Watershed Program Manager. I got here in March, and I've been learning my ass off for 6 months. I piles up the 150 corridor. I heard some people talking about it at the Hondo Collaborative, and I took a drive up here and I went, wow, there's a lot of piles. They were right. Liv and I were asked to walk the drainage, and we flagged 282 piles that were most proximate to riparian vegetation species and to the water's edge itself.
And from
ask a question on top of that, with the propensity for trees to torch out more in the winter, just having less sap and water in them, is part of the prescription for burning them. Some of these plots have half the piles are built right underneath the conifers.
You said the goal is to burn all of the piles, but is there part of the plan to skip over ones that are, I mean, even that pile or this pile, I'd be concerned about sending some of this up. So 100% doesn't mean 100%. We're going to have some leeway with maybe not lighting one, maybe scattering it. If it is
there is some of that. Or, sometimes you light a pile and then move things to the adjacent one if it is built in a place that's really going to contradict you. To be honest, perfectly honest, there are, I don't know how many, 3,000 to 5,000 piles out here. So if we start getting overly selective with that, we're never going to complete the project.
You can only control it so much, right? Because there's going to be a whole bunch of people out here burning, and there's going to be all the levels of certifications and qualifications and that onion of layers of leadership. But we can't have people like, all right, this pile, not that pile, this pile, not that pile. There's that professional autonomy of our firefighters to go out there and make their best judgments, but within reason, of course.
How many people are on the crew, on the firefighting crew?
For what crew?
The guys that are going to be lighting the
That are going
fires.
to be lighting this. It's going to be, and I don't want to speak for Brent here, it's going to be a collaboration of multiple agencies.
And how many would that come to, I wonder?
So there's a minimum organization that's required by the burn plan, and it's usually 5 to 6 people.
5 to 6 people.
But
okay.
Whenever we're trying to tackle something that's this big of a task, I would bet we would have upwards of 30 people some days out here. It'll depend day to day on who we can get from cooperating agencies and agreements, our local group and all that stuff. But there'll be some days where there'll be a lot of people up here, and that's not even counting the support organization of people who are dispatch and fire information, and the folks who are going to be manning the booths and talking to people and all that. So it's this is a big undertaking. For a pile burn, this is, almost as complex as it gets.